All right, welcome back to Bits and Bytes with Scott Macri. And today I am going to go and show you how you can create an application, a command line interface application where you can get input from a user. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first thing I have is I've already created some skeleton code for us. I have our person object and our person module from the last few lessons that we've used. I cleaned it up a little bit. The only thing I left in here was the string method and then our init method, and I slimmed down the constructor parameters to just first name and last name, and it makes it look a little cleaner. Plus, when you use other tools like Pylint, they'll call you out on having too many parameters in your init and in your other methods. So that's a good thing to get used to paying attention to. So the next thing is I created a JSON file, which you can see over here, personrecords.json, and I put some basic stuff in it because this is what we need. We have a key called person records, and then it has a value of an empty list, and that list is what we're going to populate with the records that we're going to be creating. And then now we have this executor file. And the executor file is the one that we're going to run. You can see when I run it now, it doesn't do anything yet because there's nothing in it. Simply importing the person module, well, the person class from the person module or the person.py file. Okay, that gives us access. Remember, that gives us access to all this stuff in here. And then I have a main method that doesn't do anything. And then I have this that calls the main method. So this is a way to have a method in your code that doesn't do anything without giving you an error. You can't just have an empty method, in other words. So I just put that in there as a filler temporarily. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start writing some code. So the first thing we want to do is we want to be able to read the person records information into memory. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to operate on this as a data dictionary. Remember, we had a video in the past about reading and writing JSON data to and from a disk and things like that and in memory. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to change it up a little bit. I think in the last one we used the JSON loads method, which, remember, the S, it's plural, which means that stands for string. And we're going to use a little bit different approach here where we're going to read the file directly. So if you recall, we use the with keyword that handles like the close on our files and stuff like that when we open files. So we can open the file. It'll close it automatically when we're done using it is what that does. And it does a few other things as well. It helps with error handling and stuff. So we're going to read personrecords.json, and then we are going to, let's do this. We'll do it as file. We'll just call it file. And then we're going to do JSON data. That'll be our variable that we use when we read the information from the file. To put it in memory, we're going to store it in a variable called JSON data. And then what we do is we open that file. We saved it as a variable called file. So we've read everything from this file into memory. And then we're going to stick it in a variable called file, which is what that does. And then we're going to do JSON load, not with an S, just with load, because a load is an I/O, so it's for file I/O. So you can pass it a stream, a file stream, or a file object, so to speak. So we can pass file in there, and it'll read the information from that file. It'll store it in a variable. So let's start from the top. So it's going to open the file. Remember, we don't have the second parameter here, but the default is R for read. Okay? And then we're going to open it with a variable name of file. Then we're going to read it into the contents of the file as JSON into an object called data dictionary. So we're reading the JSON from the disk, and this is going to convert it to a data dictionary. So this is going to be a data dictionary, a Python data dictionary. Then it's going to close our file for us. So now when we run this, nothing's going to happen. I just want to run it just to make sure that we don't have an error in the code or a syntax problem. So now something did actually happen. It actually read the file and did what I just explained, but you're not going to see any output because it doesn't do any printouts or anything. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start working with loops and if statements. We covered a little bit on if statements in the past. We haven't done anything really, I don't think, with loops yet. So the first one we're going to do is a while loop. And with a while loop it'll evaluate something, whatever's in the block, until a condition becomes true, or false rather. So when you say something like, we're going to create a toggle, I'll explain it again in a second where it can actually make sense, because a picture's worth 1,000 words, like I always say. So we're going to create a variable called toggle, and we're going to set it equal to true. Now we're going to use that toggle right here. Okay, so in our while thing, so anything in here, which is where the pass keyword is, we're going to write our code in there. So it's going to loop through here continuously until this value gets triggered gets detected as false somewhere inside the block. So now that it's true, the first time through it's just going to run. And then we're going to do a print statement to get some information from the user. So we'll ask a question like, do you want to create a record? So type a 1 for creating a new record, and type a 2 to exit, we'll say. So if we want to exit, that's what our toggle is going to be used for. We can set that to false inside of our block, and that'll kick us out of the block and it'll exit. So you'll see in a second how that works. And then we're going to create another variable for the user input. And there's a function within Python that you can use, and that's what it's called. It's called input. So when you call input accepts a parameter, and it'll do something similar to like what print does. It'll print out whatever you pass in as a parameter to the screen. So for example, we can say select a number. Okay, so now when this runs, it's going to print out this, and then you're going to pick a number, and then whatever it reads in, whichever number you type, is going to come into this variable. So if I type in a 1, it's going to be stored in the command variable. So this input reads whatever the user types when they get prompted for this. It'll make sense in a minute when you actually see it all play out. Just be aware that this is actually prompting the user for input, and it's going to save the response from the user, whatever characters they type in the command line at that point. It'll look like this, and it's going to save those in that variable. Then we got to do our if statement. So an if checks if something is true. So we're going to say if command equals 1. We got to do a string because the information gets passed in as a string. Even if we type in a number, it's coming from the command line, so it's always going to be a string. And we got to end our if statement with a colon. Then we can start doing some more stuff in here. Now we can create another print statement and just tell the user what you're going to do, what they're actually doing. So we'll just say something like create an entry. That way they have some information as to what is going on. And then we'll print an empty line. That prints just an empty line on the screen, because this is all going to be displayed on the screen. And then we need to prompt them for the first name, because remember, the first name and the last name are part of the init method. So in order to create the person object, those are required. So we cannot create a person object unless we have those two values, because we have to pass them into the constructor. And the constructor is what's used to build the object. So we'll do first name equals, and then we got to do another input to prompt the user for input. We'll say enter first name, and then we'll do last name. Another input to prompt the user for the last name. Okay, now we got the user's first name, or the person's first name and last name. Then now we can create our person object that we're actually going to use, because we want to populate, remember, we want to populate the rest of these fields as we get user input from the user. And we want to put that information in here. So I'm going to save that file. And now, so we'll do enter last name, and then we'll create our person object. And we got to get those variables. Remember, those variables are passed in. They're saved as a variable, rather. The information passed in by the user is saved into these variables. So these are the variables we're going to use here. So we will do first name, because we're going to do them in order, because the first parameter is first name. Another way to do that is you could do a named parameter, which would be something like this. And you could actually do it like that. Right? Now, what that's going to do is that's going to go in here and it's going to look for the first name parameter, and it's going to say, oh, first name is a parameter, so that's what we're going to pass in. So you don't have to worry about putting them in order. But we don't need to do it like that, because we're just going to put them in order. So as long as you put them in the order that this expects, I keep clicking on the wrong tab, as long as you put them in the order that they're defined in here, they'll match. If they're out of order, then you have to do parameter naming. Okay, so we got the person object created now, and it'll have the values that the user types in for first name and last name. Now it gets a little tricky. We're going to use another loop. We haven't really talked about much with looping, but a for loop. So you type for, and then you have to pass it a list. And then every time it iterates through the list, it's going to grab an item out of the list, and it's going to use that item to do something. But that item that you're pulling out is going to need a name. It's going to need a variable, rather. So because otherwise you can't use it. You won't have anything to use with it, or any way to use it, rather. So we're just going to call it field, right? And then we will go in. Now, here's another trick. What this vars thing, so what this is saying is this saying for field in our list. I'll explain what the list is in a minute. Do something. Whatever we tell it to do inside the code block is what it's going to do. And you can operate on this field object, or this field variable. Now what vars does is, if you recall, I think it was a blog post that I did a while ago, I talked about another similar method called dirs, like this, or dir, like that. And it's similar to that, whereas the dir will populate, it'll pull out all the methods and attributes, whereas the vars will pull out, it'll create a list of these guys right here, the variables that we created. So when you do vars and pass it the person object, it's creating a list populated with these, right? I hope that makes sense. Now what we're going to do is we're going to iterate over that list, and we're going to pull each element out of that list and do something with it. And the way we access each individual element of that list is with this variable here. That's what the for loop does. So we're going to do another if statement, and we're going to say, we'll do something like, if field is not equal to first name. Remember, because we got first name and last name up here, right? We already got first name and last name here from input. But now we're going to iterate through this entire list. It's going to, when we do that for loop, it's going to grab everything in here. First name and last name are in here, but we can discard those because we already have them. So we want these items down here. So that's why we're doing the loop the way we are. So we're saying ignore first name. And remember, another thing to point out is that we used underscores in here because that's a good way to distinguish that they came from, that they're part of self. So when you do other methods and stuff like that and you reference them, self underscore, it's a good standard to follow. Now we're going to do another part of the for loop. We're going to say field, F-I-E, whoops, I want to put another, I'm going to say and. I'll explain this in a minute. Not equal to last name. Okay. Now what this is going to do is this is an and statement. So now what this if statement's going to do is it's going to look at these conditions that we wrote in here. And it's going to check to see if they're true. And it's going to it has to validate to make sure both conditions are true because there's an and statement. So if they're both true, it's going to execute the code in the block. If this one comes out false, then it's just going to ignore it. If this one comes out true and then this one comes out false, it's going to ignore it. It's going to skip right over the if statement. But the important thing to notice or to pay attention to with an if statement, if the first condition is false, it's not going to check the second one because it's an and. If it was an or, then it would check. But because it's an and they both have to be true, if the first one evaluates to false, it knows that it can jump out, so it'll jump out. Now inside of our if statement, we're going to create something called new field because we're going to have to do another input here. Let me write this out and then I'll explain it. Remember the f strings, so that allows us to put variables inside the string that get evaluated as part of the string. Let's see, I think if we do something like, we got to use single quotes in here because we have double quotes on the outside of the string, so we don't want a conflict. And then we'll do that, and then I'll explain what this means in a second. And then we got to close, let's see, what did I do here? I missed something. All right, I got to close this, that. That. As a software developer with multiple decades of experience, I can tell you with 100% certainty there are a lot of dangers to using a personal computer and having a home network. The three largest risks are hackers, malware, and eavesdroppers. All three of these malicious actors are out to get your personal information, steal your money, and wreak havoc on your personal life by any means possible. Antivirus software is not able to protect you from every attack. It's your responsibility to do everything in your power to prevent being taken advantage of. This is why I recommend using a virtual private network for your home network and devices. A VPN, as they are called, can stop an attacker dead in their tracks. VPNs create an encrypted tunnel to a remote server where you perform all of your internet activities. This technique also makes all of your internet activities anonymous. This is by far one of the best solutions to protect your home network and devices. So go to scottmacri.com/VPN to learn more about VPNs and sign up. Click the ExpressVPN link to get the best deals. Again, that's scottmacri.com/VPN. That's scottmacri.com/VPN. So now you might be looking at this and it might look a little strange to you. But what this is these are called F strings. And an F string with a double quote and a string inside allows you to pass in variables. Like remember our field variable. So we're passing that in. You got to pass it in with squiggly brackets, inside of squiggly brackets. So whatever's inside of the squiggly brackets gets evaluated and then becomes part of your string. So we have a field object or a variable, which in our case it's a string because it's going to go and it's going to pull the value from whatever this is, whichever step it's at. It's going to pull the value out, it's going to put it in the field variable, and then it's going to evaluate it here. Now remember, strings are lists in Python, so we can operate on them in a similar manner. And strings have a method called replace. The first parameter is the method, or is the character that you want to replace. Then it's what you want to replace it with. I don't have anything in here, which means just delete it. And then it's going to say the first instance of it. So for example, what it's going to do is it's going to come over here and it's going to look at this and it's going to remove it. But it's not going to remove this one. So for all these ones, they're only singles. They don't have a second underscore, so it doesn't matter. So it's only like on street, it's only going to remove the underscore in front of street. Now the reason I did that is because this is the information that gets displayed on the string to the user. And you want to say enter street. You don't want to say enter underscore street, right? You don't want the output or you don't want the commands to look funny to the user. You don't want to say enter underscore street because that just looks silly. So let me save that file real quick. So that is going to replace the underscore with nothing. So that means delete it. And then it's going to only act on the first instance of that. So now if we took this number 1 out and then the field was first name, it would remove both of these. So then essentially what you would have is you'd have something like, it would look like that. But for street, when we do street, because street only has 1 underscore, it's literally just going to replace the underscore with nothing. So it'll look like that. So when it prints out to the user, it'll look nice and clean for them. Now, we're going to get into something else new here. I think we talked about get attribute before. Now we're going to talk about set attribute. So in order to set the attributes on our person object, a lot of languages have things known as setters and getters. In Java, they're very popular. When you create a Java bean, you got to have setter methods and getter methods, which you use to insert values into your attributes or get values from your attributes. Well, Python has a method that you can use, or function that you can use to do this on the fly. You don't have to type all your getter and setter methods. And it's called set attr. It stands for set attribute. So we're going to do set attribute. We got to tell it which attribute or which object that we're operating on. So that's person. Then you got to tell it which attribute up here, which one of these guys you want to set. And in our case, it's going to be whatever the current field value is. So it'll be state, city, zip. Remember, because it's iterating through this list over here. So then we'll say field, because it's whatever current iteration of field we're at, which comes from the vars list. Try to say this several times in different ways because it might make sense in one way to someone and not in another way. And then we're going to tell it which value we want to use. So we want to use new field. So essentially what this is going to do is through each iteration, it's going to grab the person object, it's going to grab whichever attribute iteration we're on, so for example street, and then it's going to replace it with whatever the value for new field is. So just to be clear, that this is the part that the user sees, is where we're stripping the underscore out. And then whatever they type in gets saved into the new field variable. And that value that they pass in is what we're setting the attribute at. I just want to make sure that that's clear, that it's the value that the user types in and not what we're stripping out. So for example, if I type in Florida for state, it's taking the value of Florida and it's populating in the person object the state attribute. But the user's not going to see the underscore in the prompt. Okay, so now that that is hopefully clear, we're going to go to the next step, and we have to go back here, because remember, spacing in Python is very important. That's how the application knows which line is which. You know, if it's a block of an if statement, it has to be indented. It can't be out here, or Python, it won't work. It'll error out. So now we want to get the JSON. Remember I said we have this JSON thing, which is now a data dictionary, because we did this and we loaded it in this variable called JSON data, and that converts it to a data dictionary. And so what we want to do is we want to operate on this list. Remember, list has a field or an method called append, and we can use the append to insert items into a list, which we've covered that in the past. So we're going to take our list, JSON data, which is, remember, that's our empty list that we pulled out, that we read from the file. And then we're going to save it back into the file when we're done. So this is going to say, give me the person records, the value of person records in the person records file, because the person records file is what we read. But it's the person records key. The file name and the key name are the same. They don't have to be. I just did it that way. And it's going to say, give me the value. And the value is right now is an empty list. Okay? So give me the value. And then we're going to append. Here comes again. Okay? So essentially what's happening is, remember, each time we go through this is one iteration in this loop. And every time we go through it, all this stuff is going to happen. At the end of our block, we have this here. And what's happening is we're populating all these values that are coming in the person object, right? And then we're going to take the person object, we're going to execute vars again on that person object after the values are populated. And then we're going to append that, so that way we can store it. We can store it over here. It'll make sense when you see it in a minute. Now this is a little different than the last one we did, because we were using pickle, and we were just pickling the objects directly into the file. You could very easily do this with pickle. It would actually probably be a lot simpler. But the advantage of using JSON is that you can easily use it outside of a Python application. You could pass it to a Java application. You could pass it over the internet and give it to someone else, and then they could use that data set. And they don't have to have a Python application. So that's the advantage. It's a way of transmitting data. It's a very popular and widely used method of transferring data over the wire, like I've mentioned a few times. As a software developer with multiple decades of experience, I can tell you with 100% certainty there are a lot of dangers to using a personal computer and having a home network. The three largest risks are hackers, malware, and eavesdroppers. All three of these malicious actors are out to get your personal information, steal your money, and wreak havoc on your personal life by any means possible. Antivirus software is not able to protect you from every attack. It's your responsibility to do everything in your power to prevent being taken advantage of. This is why I recommend using a virtual private network for your home network and devices. A VPN, as they are called, can stop an attacker dead in their tracks. VPNs create an encrypted tunnel to a remote server where you perform all of your internet activities. This technique also makes all of your internet activities anonymous. This is by far one of the best solutions to protect your home network and devices. So go to scottmacri.com/VPN to learn more about VPNs and sign up. Click the ExpressVPN link to get the best deals. Again, that's scottmacri.com/VPN. That's scottmacri.com/VPN. So now what we have to do is we have to actually write it back to the file. So we're going to go and open the file again, because remember the with statement closed it. Once we execute this and it saves it to that variable, that file gets closed. Now we're going to reopen it, And you don't have to do it like this. You don't have to use with. You could just open it, operate on it, and then close it at the end. You can do that just as easily, but I just wanted to do it this way just to emphasize it. Plus, it's better because if your application crashes in the middle of it and you've already done 10 records, you'll lose all 10 of those records. Whereas if each iteration, if you're saving it through each iteration of the loop, you can only ever lose one record if your application crashes. So there's advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantages is that it takes more time to read and write from disk multiple times. So for our little application, that doesn't matter. But when you get into big enterprise applications and you're getting hundreds of thousands or millions of people hitting it, or even thousands of people hitting it, that can cause performance hits. So we're going to read personrecords.json. And remember, we got to tell it, because the default is read. We don't want to read it. We want to write it this time. And we'll just say as file. We'll call it file again. And we're going to use dump. Remember, that's the same as dumps with an S, but dumps with an S is for strings. And dump without an S is for streams. So data streams, so writing a file to disk. Whoops. So JSON data is our object that we want to pass, and then file is the file. So this is taking our JSON data, which is, it started out as our person object, right? We have this JSON data thing up here, which is what we read from the file. And then we used that, we populated person, and we could have easily just populated that array directly using a data dictionary, but I want to emphasize the use of objects, so that's why we're using a person object. You could have just used a data dictionary for this purpose if you really wanted to. But if we were getting a person object, if there was another process for populating the person object or whatever, something like that, you know, it's much easier to deal with objects than it is with data dictionaries in a lot of cases, especially if they're large. So this is really, it emphasizes the use of object-oriented programming. We have our JSON data, we populate our person, and then we take the variables from that person object and we save it in that key. And then we're going to write that to disk with the JSON dump and the file write. All right, and then let's not forget about our toggle up here. Why do we have that? Well, that's our exit out of the program. So underneath this if statement, we need to create another else. So if somebody passes in anything other than, hang on, let me type this. If someone passes in anything other than a 1, which executes this block, it's going to execute the else statement. So if they type a number 2, it's going to set this to false. Next time through the iteration, the while loop is going to check the toggle, and it's going to see that it's false, and it's going to exit, and our program is going to end. Now there's another way we can do this. There's another library that we can import. It's called sys, like that. And then that has a method on it that is you could use. It's called exit. But I'm just using this because it's a little bit more graceful. And we'll get into reasons why that's more graceful at a later date. So now this should work for us if we run. All right, let's make sure our person thing is good. Make sure there's no funny stuff in there. And then let's execute it and see if we get any errors. Okay, it worked the first time. Perfect, no errors. So that means I'm great at typing today. Now, if I just hit a 2 and I hit enter, it's just going to exit. See, and you can see over here my little assistant tells me if there's any bugs or problems in my code. It'll analyze it. Now, I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to run it again. And then I'm going to type 1. And then that's going to start the process that we created in here. So it's going to say 1, create record. And then if I type that, it's going to say, so it's going to jump into here. So I'll do 1, boom. And then now it says enter the first name. I'll just use my name. Enter the last name. And then it's going to say, oh, I got a typo somewhere in here. And I see exactly what it is, so I'm going to kill this. And I can hit Control C. It's not going to let me out. I got to hit stop up here. It's not going to let me out. Okay. So what I did is I left off this, because remember, the field inside person actually contains an underscore. And for some reason I inadvertently removed that, so it didn't pick that up. So when it ran vars, when it was iterating the vars loop, it was still picking up last name because this was a typo, because it didn't match what's in here for last name. You can see it's got an underscore. And over here it didn't have the underscore. So I got to put the underscore back in. And I can verify that there isn't any records in here. I can refresh that. All right, didn't save anything. Now I'm going to rerun this. Let me clear the screen down here to make it a little nicer. And I'll run this. It's running a little bit slow for some reason. So now I'm going to do create record. And first name. Street. City, state, zip code, and phone. And you can see it prompted me for all that, and when I hit enter, it's going to go back to another iteration of the loop, because this toggle has not been set to false yet. It's still true. So now when I type a number 2, or if I type anything else, it's going to execute the else block, and it's going to execute the program. So the program is ended. And now we can see what we saved. We can come over here and we can refresh this. Say yes, and then it shows the data that we just entered. See, it's got all the data in there. I should probably find a better way to, a plugin or something probably for Thani, where I can have it format this nicely. That way every time when I do it. But you get the point. So now if we do another one, just for giggles, let's do another one. We'll run it again, and then we'll say number 1, Joe Blow, I'll say the same thing. Yeah, whatever. And we'll do something like that. Phone. All right, and then we'll do a 2 to exit. And then now when we come over here and we refresh this guy, you're going to see that it saved 2 records now. I want to get it at the front. Street. See? And then you can see that the second record starts right here for Joe. So Joe Blow 456, yada, yada, yada. So this is basically, I'll do a quick walkthrough. I'm not going to spend too much time because I reiterated things several times. But what we did is we created an application where we can get user input and write it to a file in JSON. So basically we went through a while loop, which checks to see if the condition is true, and if the condition is true, then it executes the block, otherwise it exits. And then we went through, we have an if statement to check to see the user input based on the input function. So the input function prints this out to screen, its parameter it prints out to screen, and then it saves whatever the user types in to a variable, which in our case is command. And then we have our person object down here, where we get the first name and the last name. And we have to do that, remember, because it's part of the instantiation of the object, so we need those first. And then we have our for loop. The for loop grabs each individual item in the list one at a time, saves them in this variable, and then we can operate on that variable within the block. The vars pulls the list of attributes that we've created over here and converts those, it puts those into a list basically that we're iterating. Well, not basically, that is what it does. Then we have our if statement, and we have an and condition in here. It evaluates this in order to run this block of code, and then we're stripping out the underscores just for aesthetics, so it doesn't show up on the front of these for the user, to make it more visual pleasing to the user. And then our set attribute, which is what we use to set the actual value of that specific field on the person object. And then we're populating the value of the person records key with that data from the person. So it passes in all these fields with their respective values, just like you see here. So it's going to say first name, Joe. And again, we could have stripped out the underscore on here. I just didn't go through that to do it. We could have stripped it out. It would have just taken more time. And in all reality, in the real world, you'd probably want to do that depending on what you're using the data dictionary or the JSON for. So anyways, and we went through, we saw this before in the past. We added a little bit of a change here where you can use streams. You can pass a file stream to it. And then we got our else toggle. And you've seen this a few times in the past, and you've seen the main method a few times in the past. You've seen the imports in the past. And we are going to talk more about other libraries in the future. My name is Scott Macri. This is the Bits and Bytes video channel. And I just want to thank you for watching, and please take a look at my sponsors. Please take a look at my website. And please post in my comments and subscribe to my channel and to my blog. Thanks.